Another batch of fentanyl, all told, last fiscal year to kill 90 million people. I know you don't want to talk about it.
No, it's not that I don't want to talk about it.
Security.
This is entirely your issue, and I understand. And we have had a whole interview on this. Kellyanne, we're not talking about border security right now. We're talking about U.S. domestic terrorism, white nationalism.
You played the president's clip.
Yeah, now I've also played the president's words, and I want to know.
The president announced today domestic terrorism.
Fine.
He's denouncing. His U.S. attorney, the law enforcement in Texas has already designated this domestic terror. That means the president's federal government and state government agree it is domestic terrorism.
Okay.
We want
now the words, Kellyanne. Now the words, because most people who study this, including FBI, including the experts on this, not the chattering classes, not the armchair, observers, but the experts say that there are climates of hate that are created, and usually from the top. So I'm asking you, will you and the president's advisors seek to restrict his Twitter use and his other use of these words, what he said about Elijah Cummings, what he said about Baltimore, what he says about migrants.
Christiane.
Yes or no? It's simple, because if it's no, it stays there at the top.
Here's why. No, I'm not telling you what I discussed with the president.
No, I'm asking you, do you agree with that? Do you agree with it? Infestation, invasions. These are important words.
Keep repeating
Look back in history, Kellyanne.
Because a day ago, your network insisted that this president would not come out and denounce racism, white supremacy, bigotry, call this evil, call him a monster, try to fix our mental health.
Okay, so the simple question and follow-up is, will he then not say those things on the air, on Twitter, on social media again? I mean, you're telling me what he says.
I'm not going to allow you to conflate him with the murderers here.
Oh, come on.
And,
you know I didn't do that. I'm asking about his words.
I heard a lot of words. Well, I heard a lot of words on your network and others the last couple of days.
Kellyanne, it's you and me talking now, not about networks. I'm asking you very simply. Well, this is what the world says.
You have to own it. You have to own it.
The world says the Sydney Morning Herald had a striking headline yesterday, according to the CJR. U.S. in the midst.
I'm going to repeat myself.
U.S. in the midst.
The president has denounced white supremacy, domestic terrorism. This person should face the death penalty. He is evil.
Right. U.S. in the midst of a white nationalist terrorism crisis. Another newspaper, a British one, writes, gun deaths seem factored into the discourse. Acceptable losses. In America, these shootings cannot be stopped.
I'm the one who just said that our FBI has an increase in arrests in domestic terror, some of which are fueled by white supremacy, some of which are fueled by other racially motivated hate. This is positive. We should applaud the efforts of the Department of Justice and the FBI under this president's administration that's actually stepped up these efforts.
All of that is good, and the president calling out mental health, red flags, monsters is all good. But he did not mention guns, for instance, in the speech today. The president is massively popular in the Republican Party. He has more than 70% approval rating. If you look at Australia after a gun massacre, if you look at New Zealand after the gun massacre, if you look at Britain after its Dunblane gun massacre, there were laws enacted. I know there are different parliamentary and presidential systems, but the president is very, very powerful and popular, and people tend to do in his party what he suggests. Will he now discuss the prevalence and the easy use without sensible gun laws of guns like this guy had?
The president will have more to say this week, and the president also has addressed this issue. Actually, it's his administration, not the previous one, who, by the way, deported 3 million people, that did away with bump stocks, has the fixed NICS, came out with an entire school safety commission report that got very little attention, as did Director Wray's testimony about the issues you want to talk about today. Since he testified the day before Bob Mueller, nobody wanted to cover it. It's actually the testimony that mattered and was coherent and relevant to today's conversation. So this president and his administration are doing much. We will continue to do more. But Christiane, every time you talk about passing laws, you know full well who passes the laws in this country. Congress, but they're on their 6-week recess. Why did they leave in the first place? All this grandstanding, call us back, call us back. And they're welcome to come back if they like, but will they? And I would tell you that, for all the grandstanding by the 2020 crowd this weekend, again, getting clicks and kicks and ratings and their jollies, and some of them with their potty mouths cursing out the president. What we saw today was the president, the one and only president, addressing a nation and a world and telling them white supremacy, racism, evil, bigotry is completely unequivocally denounced. And here are 5 or 6 concrete steps we can take together. But we need Congress to do that. He directed the Department of Justice to work on legislation that would have the death penalty for crimes just like this evil monster in El Paso. But legislation is Congress's business. We know they failed to do their job on so many things this year. They're too busy doing all this nonsense to actually do so many things to fix the problems that you're laying out and others. Congress, do your job. I mean, they wait to react. They're gone for 6 weeks. This president's here. We're working today. They can come back, but they won't. Well, and if they do, it'll just be a lot of speeches. But every time you say, let's make a law, that's a question for Congress. This president stands ready to act and laid out some very concrete proposals that even your network was covering today. Here are 5 or 6 concrete things we can do. But pull that testimony by FBI Director Wray on July 23rd. It was quite telling, and many of the answers are there. There's so much going on in the domestic terrorism space, but we all need to be able to say something also when we see something, and even if that's a loved one that we feel could be a menace. You can actually, people watching right now could help mitigate damage like this, could maybe even save a life or many lives by speaking up, in addition to what our local and federal and state law enforcement are doing.
Well, we will continue to watch and see how that all, in terms of legislation, pans out. And we'll watch also from where you are, the White House, see what comes out of there. Kellyanne Conway, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Christine.
There's breaking news in the El Paso mass shooting investigation. The arrest affidavit for the suspected gunman quotes him as saying he was targeting Mexicans. The affidavit also says when he surrendered to police, the suspect told them, quote, "I'm the shooter." This comes as President Trump says he's spoken with congressional leaders and sees bipartisan support for gun law reforms. In a question and answer session as he left the White House today, Trump repeatedly touted the possibility of a deal on what he calls, quote, very meaningful background checks. He also predicted the National Rifle Association will come around, or in his words, be a little bit more neutral. The group already is signaling it's against the current proposals to expand background checks or enact red flag laws. I'll discuss gun reforms and more with Democratic Congressman Jackie Spear of California and our correspondents and analysts.
I haven't seen any new public stances from either of them. In a week where 31 people were killed in mass shootings, President Trump is claiming tonight that Republicans are behind him on background checks.
I spoke to Mitch McConnell yesterday. He's totally on board.
But his optimism is at odds with what the GOP has said publicly. The Senate Majority Leader signaled Thursday he's open to considering new legislation.
The key to this, honestly, is making a law and not making a point.
But his office is making clear he's endorsed nothing yet.
Okay, this isn't a question of NRA, Republican, or Democrat.
The president also says he's confident he can persuade the gun lobby.
I had a good talk with Wayne.
Sources tell CNN NRA Chief Wayne LaPierre warned Trump his base isn't on board with tougher background checks.
I think in the end, Wayne and the NRA will either be there or maybe we'll be a little bit more neutral.
And after the shooting in Parkland, Florida, it was the gun lobby that ultimately swayed the president. Asked why the country should believe him now, Trump denied changing his mind.
No, I never said what I'm saying now.
Asked what his message is for the children returning to school who fear mass shootings, Trump said they have nothing to worry about.
Go and really study hard, and someday you'll grow up and maybe be president of the United States.
The president leaving Washington today for his own vacation as he's facing new scrutiny over his trip to El Paso, Texas. Now that a photo has surfaced of him grinning and flashing a thumbs up while the First Lady holds a 2-month-old orphaned baby whose parents were murdered.
They're going to be brought out. And this serves as a very good deterrent. But you had many people
asked if Democratic presidential candidates labeling him a white supremacist will help him with voters, Trump called it a disgrace.
First of all, I don't like it when they do it because I am not any of those things. I think it's a disgrace. And I think it shows how desperate the Democrats are.
The president also taking a swing at Joe Biden after he made this mistake Thursday night.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
Joe is not playing with a full deck.
On what they have.
When it comes to his cabinet, Trump also doesn't have a full deck.
Sue did a great job. I like Sue Gordon very much.
He's now searching for a new director of national intelligence and a deputy director after Sue Gordon resigned Thursday, saying in a note it was out of respect and patriotism, not preference. Sources said it became clear Trump wasn't going to pick Gordon for the top job, despite wide support from Senate Republicans.
I'm in no rush because we have a great acting.
Now, Jim, we also have some breaking news into the Situation Room tonight, and that's that shortly after those immigration raids you saw there in Mississippi, the White House instructed senior ICE officials to conduct more of those workplace enforcement operations this year. It's those kind of operations that can lead to the arrests like the ones you saw in Mississippi, where nearly 700 undocumented immigrants were arrested, the ones that the president defended today as he was leaving the White House.
It sounds like he and the White House like what they saw in Mississippi. Caitlin Collins, thank you very much. With us now is California Democratic Representative Jackie Spear. She's a member of the Oversight and Intelligence Committees. Congresswoman Spear, thanks for joining us. The El Paso shooter admitted to authorities that he was the shooter, and he told them he was targeting Mexicans. What is your response to that?
Well, it's consistent with his manifesto. It's also consistent with the kind of language used by the president in terms of wanting to target Mexicans. In the rhetoric he uses, it's very hot, it's very pointed, and he is reaping what he has sowed.
And have you heard President Trump offer any condolences specifically to the Mexican community or the Latino community? And has he acknowledged the motivation behind this attack to your satisfaction?
Not at all. And the president is not likely to do either of those things because he never apologizes. He never backs down. It's always about him. And that horrible, creepy picture of him with a thumbs up with Melania holding an orphaned infant, I think says it all. He is, as the psychologists and psychiatrists have said, he's a malignant narcissist, and it's always about him.
You were disturbed by that photo?
Of course I was. I'm also disturbed by the crying children of these undocumented workers in Mississippi. What about throwing the book at the employers that intentionally hire undocumented workers and use them and abuse them and then feel comfortable releasing them and getting another whole group of people? These are jobs that Americans, frankly, won't take.
And let's turn to our nation's gun laws. President Trump now says the country needs what he calls intelligent background checks, although we're not exactly sure what that means precisely. And he says the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is, quote, totally on board. Do Democrats have a strategy to keep up the pressure until the Senate returns from recess? Because as you know, Congressman, you know, when you're on recess like this and people come back in a couple of weeks, folks move on.
That's right, but this issue is not moving on. This issue is going to plague this administration and Mitch McConnell until we start taking action. This is not the last of the kinds of mass shootings that we will see this year. We will typically see more than 250. We've already seen 253 this year. More than 39,000 people were shot and killed last year from guns. So there will be another one. I say that with great pain, but it is not going away, and we're certainly not going to let it go away. Let me also point out that this background check bill is a modest provision that basically closes loopholes in an existing law. So this is not a heavy lift for Mitch McConnell, for the president, or for the Senate.
What's stopping them, do you think?
Well, in the past, what stopped them is the NRA. Now, maybe the president is recognizing that the NRA is not going to get him reelected like they did the first time with a $30 million contribution, and that he has to recognize that this is a very modest proposal but should be on the books. There's about 180,000 people every year that are declined guns because of background checks. Now, that number will grow if we close the loophole for gun shows and for online purchases.
And what about these red flag laws that you hear about that have been talked about? You survived a shooting as a young woman, Congresswoman. Do those kinds of provisions go far enough, do you think? Do you think that there's an appetite for a new assault weapons ban?
I believe very strongly that we need to reimpose the assault weapon ban that Senator Feinstein put on the books over 14 years ago. I also think high-capacity magazines need to be abandoned and need to be banned. The Dayton shooter had a 100-shot drum that he was had in his possession at the time. So when they have more firepower than the police officers that are trying to subdue them, we've got a problem. And I think there is much more that has to be done over the next few months besides passing this modest bill on background checks.
And getting back to that workplace enforcement raid down in Mississippi, we're learning that in the aftermath of that ICE raid, the White House is now directing ICE to conduct more of those types of raids. What does that tell you?
It is very consistent with the White House attitude, which is instilling fear on the Mexican-American community and those who are here, whether documented or undocumented. I just came from a town hall in an area in my district where there are a large number of Latinos. They're all afraid. They're afraid to go out. They're afraid to go to the store. And frankly, that is the case for people who are white now as well. So this is a problem that is affecting all of us. And we've got to get serious about ridding our country of guns that are weapons of war.
And Congresswoman, you also serve on the Intelligence Committee, so I want to get your reaction to this New York Times report that President Trump rejected an intelligence briefing from Sue Gordon, the former director or deputy director of national intelligence, last week. The White House denies this, but could that potentially put the country's national security at risk if he's objecting to this briefer or that briefer during a national security briefing?
Well, I think the president puts our country at risk frequently. He does not have daily briefings by the intelligence community like our previous presidents have done. He gets briefings maybe once or twice a week, and as we know, there are certain people he just doesn't even want to have come brief him because he just doesn't like their personality. Well, this is not a personality game. This is our country's security at stake, and he needs to be briefed. He needs also to be willing to listen to what the briefers are telling him. The fact that Russia has so impacted our elections in 2016 and again attempted in 2018 is something he doesn't want to hear. So he wants to rid the intelligence community of the people that came up with that intelligence analysis. That's not going to keep us safe.
All right, Representative Jackie Spear, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Up next,
thank you for the invitation.
President Trump today dismissed all of them as lousy candidates, but the 2020 Democrats are firing back and eager to take them on. Tonight, Democratic presidential candidates are taking President Trump to task on gun control. CNN's Arlette Saenz is following the 2020 campaign from Iowa. Arlette, what are these Democrats saying about the president as well as their own plans for gun safety?
Well, Jim, gun control has really returned as a focal point in the 2020 campaign since those shootings in El Paso and Dayton. And the Democratic presidential candidates have been hammering away at both President Trump and the NRA over inaction, they believe, on gun control. Take a listen to what Senator Elizabeth Warren had to say in Humboldt, Iowa earlier today.
President Trump wants to have everything both ways. He wants to stir up as much hate and division as he can, and then say, oh, not me. He wants to say, oh, yes, I could support changes on gun safety, and then say, but let's all be sure to bow to the NRA. Look, that just doesn't work.
Now, Elizabeth Warren will be releasing a gun reform plan of her own in the coming day. And some of these candidates aren't just looking for changes legislatively or through executive action. There are also some of them, at least 4 of the presidential candidates, tweeted today calling on Walmart to stop selling guns, is that shooting in their store in El Paso. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, the 4 candidates who have made that call so far. And tomorrow, attention will turn over to Des Moines, where many of the 2020 Democratic field, the candidates will be speaking at a forum on gun reform. That issue really taking significance since those shootings last week. Jim.
And Arlette, bring us up to speed on this tussle today between Joe Biden and President Trump.
Yeah, Jim, this all stems from comments that the former vice president made last night in front of a group of mostly Hispanic and Asian voters when he said that poor kids are as bright as white kids. He then did go on to say wealthy kids and black kids. But the Biden campaign says that he simply misspoke and went on to correct himself. But that hasn't stopped President Trump from seizing on those comments. Earlier today at the White House, he said that it showed that the former vice president isn't playing with a full deck. I asked a Biden campaign aide about that comment from the president, and they fired back that Donald Trump's deck is full of jokers. And Joe Biden was asked about the criticism that was coming from the Trump campaign during an appearance in Boone, Iowa earlier today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Tell them it's the 2nd anniversary of Charlottesville coming up, and they need to divert something.
Amen. Are you able to, you think, go through a whole campaign with this kind of scrutiny?
Yes, I have to. It's a legitimate scrutiny.
Mr. Biden, they say these gaps in your electability.
Well, that's what we determine pretty soon, won't it?
And this comes as the Democratic presidential candidates, many of them are trying to paint the president as a divider since those shootings over the course of the past week. You now have at least 7 of the Democratic presidential candidates labeling President Trump as a white supremacist. That call has increased in the coming days, and we'll see if it continues to grow further. Jim.
Okay, Arlette Saenz in a very noisy Clear Lake, Iowa. Thank you very much. Our political experts are here to discuss all the latest news. I want everyone to stand by. We have a lot of analysis, I should say, from our experts. And turning to Susan Hennessy first. According to this arrest affidavit, the El Paso shooting suspect told police he was targeting Mexicans. What does that tell you about the suspect and the fact that he's declaring this motivation to police?
It's obviously going to make it a lot easier for federal investigators. The fact that the suspect in this case is cooperating, is being quite open about it. It's going to make it easier for them to do things like seek federal hate crime charges, which come with very substantial sentencing enhancements, because, of course, they don't have to prove this was about racial animus. The person here is actually telling it to them. You know, this is a standard feature of all kinds of terrorism. You're not just trying to target the specific victims that they've killed in this case. They're trying to send a message to instill fear in a larger group. And so for the shooter to be quite explicit that he was targeting Mexicans, that's one way to amplify that message and to try and essentially achieve the goal of terrorism. It's also important that we sort of note, this doesn't, even though we've had a lot of conversations about mental illness, this does not appear to be an individual who is mentally ill. It is an individual who is saying specifically why he committed the crime, appears to have selected victims specifically. So oftentimes whenever we see these horrific acts of violence, we want to say this has to be mental illness because it's just difficult to imagine the mind of somebody who would do something like this. But this really is a case in which it's about evil, not mental illness.
Right. And Sean Turner, we've heard the president talk a lot this week about what unfolded in El Paso and in Dayton, but we have not heard the president really talk about what this should mean to the Latino community. Do they feel protected? Has the president said enough to the Latino community in the aftermath of what happened in El Paso, do you think?
You know, Jim, I wish I could say he had, but no. Look, you know, the president is trying to strike an impossible and what I think is a misguided balance here between what he should be doing now to reassure the country and what he really wants to do. On the one hand, what the president should be doing now is he should be taking steps to not only reassure, but to protect the people in this country who are increasingly under attack because of this kind of warped ideology. But what the president really wants to do right now is he wants to send a subtle message, or not so subtle message actually, to his base and to those on the fringe of his base that when it comes to this immigration issue and these immigrants, that he's going to keep the pressure up, that he is going to continue to work to deal with this issue and to get these immigrants out of this country. And I got to tell you, Jim, there's no better evidence of that than the ICE raids in Mississippi this week. You know, the president could have picked up the phone. He could have made a 30-second phone call and said, look, this is not the time to do this. I believe in this. I think it's important, but it's not the time. But he didn't do that. In a week when we had such horrific attacks here, he decided to go forward with that. And I think that speaks volumes for where the president's mind is on this.
And Ron Brownstein, instead of pulling back, instead of the president calling off an ICE raid because of how the Latino community is struggling this week, we just heard in the last several minutes that the White House wants ICE to conduct more raids like this. They're not pulling back, they're expanding.
Look, Sean is right. I mean, from the very beginning, Jim, the core of the president's support have been the voters who are most uneasy about immigration in particular and demographic change in general. I go back to the Republican primaries in 2016. In virtually every state, it was only a minority of voters, even in the Republican primary, who said that all undocumented immigrants should be deported. But that minority voted for Trump in such overwhelming numbers back in 2016 that they provided a majority of his votes in almost every state during his march to the nomination. And he has never lost sight of that. You know, you see the president, I think, constantly. Today, for example, he had a series of tweets accusing, he said, "I'm not a racist, Hollywood is racist." And it's a reminder that the president, in following in the tracks of conservative populists really since Joe McCarthy and George Wallace and Pat Buchanan, always comes back to the argument that his voters, what he refers to as the real Americans, are under threat from two directions: contemptuous cultural elites who look down on their values, and minorities who are coming to either threaten their security or take their jobs. And he always gets back to ways to make one of those 2 points.
And Rebecca Buck, another pressure point in the president's base is on the issue of gun control. The president was saying earlier today that he believes Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is totally on board with the idea of background checks. But you and I both know, we've seen this movie before. Being totally on board on this Friday is not necessarily where things will stand when they come back from recess.
Right. And here's the thing, when we're talking about whether or not Mitch McConnell is on board here, he can be on board in principle, but all he cares about as the Senate Majority Leader is how can we put this in a piece of legislation that has enough votes to pass. He's not going to put his Republican senators in a position where they're going to have to vote for something that isn't passing, that's politically unpopular.
Or be signed by the president.
Exactly. And so the president might be right now very enthusiastic about this in principle, but the devil's in the details especially when it comes to the politics of gun control. And so that's, I think, where the divide could be here and where things could get really hairy.
Did you want to jump in, Ron?
Yeah, I do. Because, I mean, look, universal background checks is as popular as anything ever gets in American public opinion. I mean, there is consistently polling showing that over 90% of the public believes that everyone who buys a gun, no matter where they buy it, should have to undergo a background check. That includes roughly 90% of Republicans, roughly 90% of gun owners. The problem isn't public sentiment. The problem is the institutional hold of the NRA on the Republican Party, particularly in more rural, small states. If you go back to 2013, when there was the vote in the Senate on universal background checks after the school shootings in Connecticut, the senator, if you assign half of each state's population to each senator, the senators who voted for it represented 195 million people. The senators who voted against it represented about 120 million people. That's about as decisive as it gets in a democracy, and yet it was blocked because of the role of the filibuster and the near universal Republican opposition to it. That's what we're talking about. It's not a question of whether Mitch McConnell has to make people cast an unpopular vote. It's a vote that they are unwilling to cast because of the institutional influence of the NRA, separate even from gun owners within the Republican Party.
But there is a recent example of the president leading the way on a bipartisan issue, criminal justice reform. He got it done when Mitch McConnell didn't think that they could get the votes, and so that could be where this goes as well.
All right, well, we'll see about that. Okay, stand by, everybody. We have lots more to talk about. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, and let's talk about the 2020 Democratic field. Rebecca Buck, as you know, some Democratic 2020 candidates are taking their criticism of the president to a pretty incredible extreme. You would never think you would hear this in modern politics, but we're hearing it, labeling the president of the United States a white supremacist. By CNN's count, we can put this up on screen. We have roughly a half dozen 2020 Democrats accusing the president of being a white supremacist. Don't really have that graphic ready, but that's okay. We'll talk about it. Right. What do you make of this? I mean, it sounds like something that a lot of these Democrats are agreeing on. But are there any political risks in going down this road, do you think?
Well, the polling that we have seen over the past few years suggests that most Americans, we haven't pulled the question specifically, do they believe the president is a white supremacist, but is he encouraging white supremacists, white nationalists? The majority of the respondents in these polls have said yes. So it's not so much a political risk for these candidates to be saying that he encourages this ideology, but this is obviously a step further, and it's become a litmus test of sorts in this Democratic primary. What I think is noteworthy, though, we have these half a dozen candidates who have said, yes, we do believe the president is a white supremacist. Joe Biden, the front runner in the race, has not gone that far, and deliberately so. He said he does believe the president encourages this ideology, but he said, he actually expressed frustration. Why do you want me to say this word? And so he's not there yet, trying to take a more moderate approach to this question.
And Sean Turner, let me ask you about this. Let's listen to what the president had to say earlier today, whether he thinks it helps him to be called a white supremacist. Here's what the president had to say.
I don't think it helps. First of all, I don't like it when they do it because I am not any of those things. I think it's a disgrace. And I think it shows how desperate the Democrats are. They call anybody a racist when they run out of cards. I'm winning in the polls. They're desperate. They've got lousy candidates. They got bad candidates.
And Sean Turner, I mean, the fact that we're discussing whether or not it's politically advantageous for the president to be, called a white supremacist by Democrats, especially coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Charlottesville, where are we right now with our politics?
Yeah, it's a startling position to be in, a startling place to be in. Look, I talked to a former White House official recently who said to me, I asked whether or not she thought the president was a racist, and she said something that was pretty shocking. She said, no, he's not a racist. He's a brilliant strategist who understands that race plays well, that race gets him votes, and that race is a good strategy. Look, I can't underestimate, how dangerous it is for the president to look at this as a game and to treat these issues of racism and division as political tools to get reelected. All over this country, you have friends, colleagues, neighbors who are looking at each other now with an increased level of skepticism because they don't know whether or not the person that they've known and worked with and been associated with for some time buys into and espouses to these views. So this is a very dangerous thing that the president's doing, and I think that if he's using it as a political stunt, that's even more dangerous than if he is an actual racist, because if he is an actual racist, I believe that people in this country will ultimately see it and will vote him out.
Yeah, Susan Hesse, I remember talking to a senior White House official one time who said, no, I don't think the president's a racist. And I said, well, can you say that on the record? And the official would not say it on the record. I mean, what do you make of the fact that we're having this conversation, heading into the 2020 campaign, decades after the civil rights movement in this country?
Look, I think at some point you have to set aside politically advantageous and call something what it actually is, which is racism, which is white supremacy. White supremacists think Donald Trump is a white supremacist. Racists think Donald Trump is a racist. They hear his words and they feel emboldened by it. And we know that because they tell us that themselves. And the president's response to that is not to be horrified and disgusted and appalled and say, I have nothing to do with those people. I condemn those people and I'm disgusted by those people. It's to play coy and court them and sort of do a sort of a wink and a nudge because obviously he views these people as a critical part of his base.
Okay. All right. Thanks all of you for a great discussion. Ron, we're going to have to get you next time. Thanks so much to all of you. America on Edge. That's our next story. Fear and false alarms in the wake of last weekend's dual massacres. Ro Khanna, a Democratic member of the Oversight and Armed Services Committees. Congressman, thanks for joining us tonight. Let's go back to El Paso. The El Paso shooter told authorities that he was targeting Mexicans. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's horrific, and we have had an increase of these hate crimes. They are motivated by absurd ideologies, the ideology of the Great Replacement, a French author who talks about the replacement of white people. We need to call this for what it is. It's domestic terrorism, and we need the Justice Department to put the resources and the expertise to tackle this, just like they've kept us safe from international terrorism.
And do you believe the president has done enough to reassure the Mexican community, the Mexican-American community here in this country, or to address that motive of the shooting, in your view?
No, I don't. I think the president needs to give a speech about this. He needs to identify what this ideology is. It's the great replacement ideology. There's a French author, Camus, who has propagated this. It led to the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand. It led to those awful shootings in Norway. It's proliferating on the internet, on 8chan. The president needs to give a speech. Any other president would say, this is an awful ideology. We need to expose it, defeat it. And this president hasn't done that. Just one line in a speech isn't enough.
Why doesn't he do that in your view?
I have no idea other than to say that he doesn't get it. I mean, he doesn't understand perhaps how pernicious this ideology is and how contrary it is to the very founding of America. Our nation was built on the idea that we aren't a nation of blood. We're a nation committed to the Constitution and to philosophical principles. This ideology is about the most anti-American ideology you could have.
And the president says he wants to take action on background checks, and he says that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is, quote, totally on board. Democrats are skeptical, as we know. Do you think this represents some kind of narrow opening? Is there any room for optimism here, do you think?
I'm hopeful, but I've been burned before. I mean, 90% of Republicans want this. Here's the irony. Wayne LaPierre, the NRA, actually testified in support of background checks in 1999 after the Columbine shooting. So if I were the president, I'd ask the NRA, what has changed? Why are you 20 years later still not supporting this? The country wants it, and I think it would be politically disastrous for any person in the Republican Party not to vote for this at this point.
And the White House organized an event today on the rise of violent online extremism. You represent Silicon Valley. Do you think anything productive will come from this? Is Silicon Valley doing enough on all of this, do you think?
We need to do more. Certainly there are some sites such as 8chan that clearly need to do more. I mean, they have propaganda on there that incites violence. They need to be regulated, and that type of content shouldn't be allowed. But it's a complicated issue. I mean, when you have Mitch McConnell putting a video on his own campaign site about violence threatening him, then you have questions of First Amendment speech. And, you know, Twitter was criticized for removing it. So we need well-crafted regulations that will remove content that incites violence while protecting the First Amendment.
And let me ask you about those immigration raids in Mississippi this past week. The White House is actually directing ICE, from what we understand, to conduct more of those raids. What does that tell you?
Jim, it was heart-wrenching. I mean, like so many Americans, I saw those kids in tears with their parents being pulled away. And you ask, why the inhumanity of it? First of all, if we're going to go after folks, why aren't we going after the companies? They're the ones with the help wanted signs on our border. They're the ones who are hiring folks who don't have documents. Let's crack down on the companies that are doing this. And second, why are we doing it in such an inhumane way where you have people being hauled and detained when their kids may be U.S. citizens and their kids crying in schools? I mean, there was not an ounce of empathy. It seems that's what's missing in our politics, our governance. Where is the empathy for other human beings?
And Congressman, I know you're committed to be looking into this. We appreciate your time. Congressman Ro Khanna, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
And more breaking news ahead on the El Paso shooting massacre. I'll talk with Democratic presidential candidate and Congressman Tim Ryan. Does he believe the president's optimistic predictions about new? And we're back with breaking news on the El Paso shooting massacre. CNN has obtained an affidavit showing that the accused gunman told police he was targeting Mexicans. Joining me now, Democratic presidential candidate Tim Ryan, Congressman from Ohio. Congressman, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. What is your reaction to this news that the El Paso shooter actually admitted to targeting Mexicans as he surrendered to authorities?
Well, when you read the manifesto, this is not much of a surprise. That's what his intention was from the very, very beginning. And that's why this is a hate crime. We've seen hate crimes go up 25% in the last few years. This is a real issue in the United States, which is why we got to have the president create more of an environment of inclusion, of tolerance, of uniting the United States instead of dividing us. But this should be prosecuted at the highest level, and, we'll see where it goes.
And some of the language in that alleged manifesto reflects what we've heard from President Trump about immigrants and Mexicans. And now some of your rivals for the Democratic nomination are openly calling the president a white supremacist. Do you think that's an appropriate label?
Well, I think the white supremacists think he's a white supremacist. So that to me says all you need to say. David Duke Well, it doesn't matter my opinion is irrelevant, and the president doesn't listen. But I think it is a dangerous position where the white supremacists in the United States think they have a white supremacist in office. That David Duke, the leader of the KKK, is saying this president is implementing our agenda. That is a dangerous position. The most dangerous thing, though, is that this kid can get his hands on the kind of weapons that he could get his hands on and do damage. There are people in other countries who are white supremacists, but they can't necessarily get their hands on the kind of firepower that this kid was able to do and go to a Walmart and do that damage. So that's where I think we've got to focus, is how do we get this background check passed? How do we put pressure on the president, pressure on Republicans, pressure on Mitch McConnell to make sure they pass this universal background check so that we can prevent these things from happening from anybody getting these weapons.
And President Trump says that all of this talk about his motivations, racial motivations, whatever you want to call them, that is evidence that the Democrats have bad candidates. He said bad candidates earlier today. How do you respond to that?
Look, this president is in a weak position. As a sitting president with supposedly a good stock market and a low unemployment rate, this guy is as vulnerable as it gets, and he's divided the country. People are ready for a new and better agenda, which I am offering. We've got to get out of this left-right fight that we're in right now. We've got to get into new and better. We've got to start securing the American people, and that starts with towns like Dayton and El Paso, and you help secure them by passing these reforms that we need, like closing the loopholes. But people are still economically insecure. They're insecure around health care. They're insecure around the environment and climate change, obviously around immigration, obviously around criminal justice. The whole country is insecure. Jim, just quick, that Times Square video of the motorcycle backfiring and people scrambling and getting hurt and running in the bars because they thought it was the guns were going off. That is the anxiety level of almost every American today. And the president has created this environment, both economically and otherwise, and that's why he's very, very vulnerable right now.
Well, let me ask you, some of your Democratic rivals, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, they all say that Walmart should stop selling guns. What do you have to say about that?
Well, of course. I think the one of the heroes of the last few years is the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods. When he said, look, we're not going to sell these anymore. I mean, we're not talking about a hunting rifle. We're not talking about, I hunt with my oldest son. It's one of the great days of the year when we go duck hunting. And I come from Ohio. We hunt. You can protect your family, protect your home. But you don't need these weapons of mass destruction, these weapons of war. And so I would commend the Walmart for not selling those weapons anymore. To the extent that they can do it as quickly as possible, I would hope that they would, like Dick's did. I think Dick showed some real leadership.
And let me ask you, a group of gun control activists and yourself, you marched over to Mitch McConnell's hometown to call for action. Now the Senate Majority Leader says background checks, red flag laws will be front and center when he gets back. Do you have any optimism that this is going to happen when you return to Washington, when Congress returns from recess?
I'm taking a very cynical position on this because I've been burnt so much on these issues. We had almost 1,500 people there yesterday from 5 different states. The base is energized. These are Democrats, Republicans, hunters, vets. So we got to continue to apply the pressure. I think the fact that he said that means he's feeling the heat, but we've got to apply the pressure. This is, to me, is like, the Potomac two-step. He's going to just dance around a little bit and hope the news cycle changes. We can't allow that to happen, Jim. We've got to continue to apply the pressure. Moms demand action. All of these other gun rights or gun control groups need to be out there and active and putting pressure on these Republicans. I know they're feeling the heat. We just got to keep applying that pressure.
And what about these upsetting images in the aftermath of that raid down in Mississippi, that workplace raid in Mississippi by ICE? The White House, from what we understand, is now directing ICE to conduct more of these raids. What does that tell you?
There's a level of inhumanity happening now and when they conduct these raids. And I say, why aren't you going after the businesses? There have only been a handful of businesses in the United States in the last couple of years that have been prosecuted. They want these workers to come and work, and they want them in a position where they're undocumented so they can hold that over their heads and not pay them wages at all and the businesses never get busted. And this speaks to the Donald Trump economy and the Donald Trump system. There's a protected class that no matter what they do, they're okay. The banks, the economy collapses, the banks get bailed out. The auto industry collapses, the auto companies get bailed out. There's people that are hiring undocumented workers, the workers get punished, not the businesses. This is the Donald Trump economy, Jim, and this is what we're campaigning for here today. How do we flip this economy, get out of this left-right divide, get into the new and better ideas that can really transform our country? But it speaks to the level of corruption there is in the government today around that protected class, that they could do whatever they want and they consistently get away with it. And what happened in Mississippi is just another example of that.
All right, Congressman Tim Ryan, thank you very much. Good luck tonight. We appreciate it. Just ahead, President Trump is slamming Democrats for calling him a racist, but does he privately think the label could help energize his base? And tonight, new evidence that the El Paso shooting massacre was an intentional attack on Latinos. CNN has obtained an arrest affidavit that shows the alleged gunman told police he was targeting Mexicans when he opened fire inside a Walmart. The store manager tells CNN the shooter was very focused and it was clear who he was aiming for as he fired direct shots. Let's bring in our analyst to talk about this, Phil Mudd. Let me get your take right off the bat here. The El Paso suspect telling police in El Paso that he was targeting Mexicans. Your response to that?
This is a big step to me, aside from the fact that this is confirming to us that he's speaking. This is taking a step from what we thought before, that this was an act of domestic terrorism, to confirming that. Look, if you kill a family member, if you kill your boss for firing you, that's straight up murder. When you're killing immigrants because you want to return to a white America, you want to persuade immigrants to leave, that's murder with a political intent. We call that terrorism, in this case domestic terrorism. We thought that just a couple of days ago, Jim. The fact that he's speaking about his motivation is confirming to us that what we thought was in fact true.
And David Chalian out there in Iowa, this moment that we've been through this past week, this has really unified Democrats in ways that we really haven't seen very much of during this campaign.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. We were just witnessing a pretty intense Democratic debate a week ago, or just over that, Jim, and there was a lot of concern about the Democrats sort of tearing into one another. This week, this has been a unified field of Democratic candidates in aggressively pushing back on the president, on his rhetoric, on pushing and pressuring, as you just heard, Mitch McConnell on gun reform. This has been a unified Democratic Party this week in a way that they are making the case that the president is incapable of unifying the nation. And I think it's going to be a little bit before we see that intra-party battle, which no doubt will be here again. It'll be a little while before we see it again.
And Sam Vinograd, the suspect saying to police that he was targeting Mexicans. What does that do to relations between the U.S. and the Mexican government? They're already in pretty sorry shape.
That's exactly right. And as Phil said, from a counterterrorism standpoint, the president is doing exactly the opposite of basic standard operating procedure when it comes to preventing more attacks. Mexico is an important partner of the United States. We have not heard about the president getting on the phone, speaking with the president of Mexico, and figuring out how cooperatively to prevent further attacks. We haven't heard about the president meeting with Hispanic leaders throughout the country. And we haven't heard about a surge in resources to meet the threat that intelligence professionals have been screaming from the rooftops about. The FBI, the DNI, in terms of the global threat, have been talking about this. But when they briefed lawmakers or policymakers on these threats, they hit a dead end.
And Sabrina Siddiqui, let me ask you about, what is the threat that exists right now on 8chan and other fringe internet sites with respect to this kind of white nationalism, this strain of white nationalism, this far-right domestic terrorism that we're seeing in this country? How grave a threat is this? We know the White House was having a meeting earlier today about online extremism. Do you think the administration gets it?
And the president wasn't at that meeting. This is a very serious threat, and authorities have repeatedly been pointing to the fact that the country increasingly faces a real risk from domestic terrorism. And we learned through CNN's reporting just yesterday that the White House had rebuffed efforts by employees at the Department of Homeland Security to make combating domestic terrorism, which includes white supremacists, a greater part of the administration's national counterintelligence strategy. You haven't even heard the president really talk about it beyond one line in his speech on Monday that was added into the teleprompter by his aides at the last minute. There has been no moment where the president has stood back and even addressed the fact that this shooting in El Paso targeted a predominantly Hispanic community. Instead, he's out there sharing, tweets from known voices, known anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim voices. And so I think we're just going to see a lot more of the same from this president, because he's much more concerned about keeping intact his base than he is trying to bring the country together in this
And
moment.
I was going to ask Phil Mudd about that, because the president earlier this morning, even at the end of this week, where we've seen extremism targeting and going after a minority community in this country, the president retweeting a far-right extremist from Britain, Kate Hopkins. What kind of message does that send to when you're somebody in counterintelligence, when you're somebody who's in the counterterrorism community, and you see the president of the United States really fanning the flames to some extent here?
Well, let me make this real simple. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum, the people who are receiving that message. The message that they want to hear is that immigrants aren't welcome in this country, and they want to be validated. They want to be validated in a judgment that if they take action against immigrants, I'm not suggesting the president's responsible for violence. He is responsible for messages. The people listening to the president want validation to say if we take action against immigrants, it's okay. If you're at the other end of the spectrum, and if you're a right-wing extremist who doesn't like immigrants, are you going to take, A, the message that you're more isolated, that nobody in this country believes that immigrants should leave, or are you going to feel that you're validated, that people in this country actually think like you think, and that immigrants should be deported quickly from this country? Anybody listening to this who wants to be validated, even if the president doesn't want to send that message, can only take one message away. Other people think like I do. Immigrants got to go.
All right, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for all of that. We appreciate it. Coming up just hours after President Trump praised Kim Jong-un, the U.S. says North Korea has fired new missiles. We have breaking news on that straight ahead. Launches by North Korea. Just this morning, President Trump downplayed North Korea's recent string of launches and told reporters he's received another, quote, very beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un. Let's bring in CNN national security reporter Kylie Atwood. Kylie, what's the latest?
Yeah, so tonight, North Korea has indeed launched some more ballistic missiles, a U.S. official confirming that to CNN. And this comes after they've continued to do this over the past few weeks. It's kind of a pattern that we're seeing here. 4 missiles were launched in less than 2 weeks before what we saw today.
Earlier this year, he was talking about this with reporters earlier today. What's his response to all of this?
Well, we haven't heard anything officially from the White House tonight after this breaking news, but today, President Trump was telling reporters about a letter he just received yesterday from Kim Jong-un. It's a 3-page letter, and he described it when he spoke with reporters at the White House. Let's take a listen.
I think we'll have another meeting. He really wrote a beautiful 3-page, right from top to bottom, a really beautiful letter. And maybe I'll release the results of the letter, but it was a very positive.
So he's saying it's a positive letter from the North Koreans, but he's taking out some of his frustration in this ongoing situation with the South Koreans, who are the traditional U.S. ally here. A source at the White House explaining to me that Trump has grown increasingly frustrated with South Korea as these missiles have been launched, and that's growing a tension between the two countries.
All right, Kylie Atwood, thank you very much for that. Stay with us for more breaking news on the El Paso shooting and new information on a motive. Back in a moment. Tonight, we're learning that a major new reversal on U.S. environmental policy may have involved President Trump. CNN has exclusive details of an Air Force One meeting that could throw out more than a decade of scientific warnings about a controversial copper and gold mine. Senior investigative correspondent Drew Griffin reports.
The meeting took place on the tarmac during an Air Force One stopover, June 26th. Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy, a pro-mining, pro-business, anti-EPA governor, met with Donald Trump for nearly a half hour.
Just got off of Air Force One with me with President Trump.
Dunleavy has been pushing for approval of a massive gold and copper mine known as the Pebble Mine, planned for Alaska's Bristol Bay watershed, home to the breeding grounds for one of the world's largest and most pristine sockeye salmon fisheries. And after his meeting aboard Air Force One, Dunleavy said this about the president.
He really believes in the opportunities here in Alaska, and he's doing everything he can to work with us on our mining concerns.
Inside EPA sources now tell CNN the very next day, June 27th, top EPA officials in Washington held an internal video conference with Seattle and told the staff the EPA was removing a special protection for Bristol Bay and, in essence, clearing the way for what could be one of the largest open-pit mines in the world. That internal announcement was a total shock to top EPA scientists, sources told CNN, because their environmental concerns were overruled by Trump political appointees. Bristol Bay and its tributaries are regarded as one of the world's most important salmon fisheries. Roughly half the world's sockeye salmon come from here. It's been protected since 2014, when after 3 years of study, the Obama-era EPA used a rare provision of the Clean Water Act to basically veto any mining that could pose a threat. EPA scientists writing a mine would result in complete loss of fish habitat that was irreversible.
It's mind-boggling that it's still being considered at all.
Christine Todd Whitman is a Republican, a former New Jersey governor, and under President George W. Bush, ran the EPA. She has joined several other former EPA chiefs to publicly oppose the mine.
The potential damage is so overwhelming. The opposition to it up there is amazing. Over 80 miles of streams, thousands of acres could be damaged from this project.
This is the second time during the Trump administration the political appointees at the EPA have decided to remove special protections for Bristol Bay to pave the way for this huge mine. In 2017, President Trump's first EPA administrator, scandal-plagued Scott Pruitt, canceled the protections after a private meeting with the mine company's CEO. After a CNN report exposed the meeting and the lack of scientific debate behind the reversal, Pruitt backed down and put the protections back in place. Now another private meeting, this time with the president himself, has led to yet another win for the mine and removal of environmental protections for this pristine watershed.
One of the most troubling things about this administration on the environmental side is this disregard of science. They're gutting science across the agencies, across the departments, across the government.
Even if scientists at the EPA are advising you, Mr. President, this is very dangerous to the environment, to the fisheries, to the state of Alaska. If the president decides, that's the decision?
That's the decision.
And the only recourse then is for environmental groups to sue?
Environmental groups, Native Alaskans, you'll have a host of lawsuits, I am convinced.
Alaska's Governor Mike Dunleavy, elected last fall, is a huge Trump supporter. He's met with President Trump multiple times, sent this letter to the president asking for a long list of EPA reversals, including what he called the Clean Water 404 veto, a direct reference to Pebble Mine. A member of his staff used to work on the Pebble project in public relations. And at EPA headquarters, Andrew Wheeler, the former coal company lobbyist who now runs the agency, has a tie to Pebble Mine, too. He has recused himself from decision-making on the project because his former law firm represents the mine.
Jim, in response to this report, the EPA said the Obama-era protections were outdated and the mine still has to go through the approval process. Our sources are telling us it's a done deal. And when we asked about the internal EPA meeting on June 27th, the day after the governor met with the president, at first the EPA denied it even happened. But when we presented them with our evidence, they admitted the meeting took place. And our sources say that, Jim, is when officials told scientists the decision has been made and their work was not needed. Jim?
Excellent report, Drew Griffin. Thank you very much, and we'll have more news straight ahead. We end this painful week honoring the mothers, the fathers, the children, the grandparents, the neighbors, and friends we have lost to mass shootings. Funerals are beginning for the 31 people gunned down in El Paso and Dayton, their lives cut short by killers armed with weapons of war. One of them traveling across the state of Texas, police say, to specifically target Mexicans. 2-month-old Paul Gilbert lost both parents in the El Paso attack. He got to meet the president and First Lady this week, a moment he won't remember. But we won't forget this past week, will we? What kind of world is baby Paul entering? A better one, we hope, than the one we lived through this past week. I'm Jim Acosta. Aaron Burnett out front starts right now.